Learning to read and write Chinese is a daunting task, but the challenge becomes more manageable if you focus on learning the building blocks, learning how components form characters and how characters form words. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are starting a new series of episodes and articles on Hacking Chinese about the building blocks of Chinese. So that means components, characters, and words, and how they all fit together. These are topics that I've been writing about for a long time, but some of the articles are pretty old and I thought it would be worthwhile to have a look at them again, because I know much more about Chinese characters now than I did, say, 10 years ago, and I also think I have a better grasp of the pedagogy and what things actually matter the most for learners. So in this series, we are going to look at the Chinese writing system from the bottom up, starting from the simplest things and then gradually building up to more and more complex things, ending with compound words. This journey will take us a few episodes, and today we are just going to get started. I will not publish all of these articles in one go, so they will come out gradually throughout the autumn. And this is, of course, because I want some variety and there are other aspects of learning Chinese that are interesting to talk about, not just characters. As usual, when it comes to the podcast, there are also corresponding articles on Hacking Chinese that contain similar but not identical content. In the case of Chinese characters, though, it is a little bit hard for me to talk about them in a way that makes sense if you've never seen the characters, so I strongly suggest that you check out the written version of the episodes if you want to learn the characters or really get into it. Whereas if you've been learning Chinese for a little bit, you will probably be able to follow this without having the characters in front of you. And of course, there will be many things that are not about specific characters, and all of that will work fine here on the podcast. Okay, so let's get into it. Learning to read and write Chinese is not a simple task. If you want any kind of competency which will be good enough for work and for everyday life and for reading most normal text that native speakers can handle, you would need something around maybe 3,500 characters. It depends a little bit on what exactly you want to read, and of course there's much more to reading than just knowing characters. You need to know words that these characters appear in, and obviously you need to know grammar and many other things. Still, it should be clear even to someone who has never studied Chinese that if there are 3,500 characters to learn, this is obviously not an alphabet. So what are Chinese characters then? Are they pictures? No, they are not pictures either, even if it is true that most of the basic characters started out as pictures. It's incorrect to say that they are pictures. Sometimes you can see the origin of the characters, so if you look at a character like mu, which means tree or wood, it's not too hard to see that it once depicted a tree. And this has some very important implications, because if you think about it, the way we write tree in English, it's just related to the way we pronounce it. If we would have pronounced tree some completely different way, like say they do in French or Arabic, we would have used a different way of writing it because it changed in the spoken language. In Chinese, though, these basic characters are not related to pronunciation at all, so there is no information in these characters that tell you how they are pronounced. This can be a little bit hard to wrap your head around if you are new to Chinese, but it's actually not that strange. It's a bit similar to, say, the number 6 in English, if you write it with a numeral. There is no indication that it is pronounced 6, and in languages where it isn't pronounced 6, it's usually spelt in a different way. The same goes for many other symbols, such as a dollar sign. You have to learn that that thing is pronounced dollars or dollar. There is nothing in that S with a vertical stroke that tells you that that's the way it's pronounced. And this is the way most basic Chinese characters are. So if you take this character for wood or tree, mu, there is nothing in that character that tells you that it is pronounced mu. You just have to learn that. Now, if all characters were like this, it would be very difficult to learn 3,500 of them because they would flow together and it would be very complicated to have such a large number of simple symbols that were yet separate from each other. Fortunately, that's not the way Chinese works. Instead, most characters are combinations of other characters, so-called components. So you take several characters and put them together in some way and according to certain principles, and you get a new character. And this way we can then create thousands and thousands of characters. So a very simple example of this would be to take the character for mu, tree, and then put it next to ren, person, and combine them into a new character, which is pronounced xiu, and means to rest. So you get the idea of someone resting in the shade of a tree. Another example would be to take two bright things such as the sun, 日, and the moon, 月, and put them next to each other, and then you get the character for bright, 明. Of course, there are other ways of combining components, and we will look at that more in future episodes. For now, though, the important thing to realize is that Chinese characters contain components that recur over and over. Indeed, there are only a few hundred of these common components that are then combined into all these thousands of characters that you need to learn. There will always be a few weird cases, but in general, if you learn these few hundred common components, you will be able to learn most other characters fairly easily because everything you're doing is combining things that you already know. And that is much, much easier than learning a unique new symbol for something. So that's how we learn characters, but that's not all there is to written Chinese either, because we also need words. And words can consist of one character, but more commonly words in Chinese consist of two characters. So that means essentially that we take two characters and put them next to each other, not to form a new character like in xiu, the rest case we had above, but just let them sit next to each other on the page, and then we get a two-syllable word such as 中国, China, or 明年 for next year. And it's worth pointing out here that Chinese has a very strong one-to-one correspondence between characters and syllables. So if you see two characters on the page, they will almost always be read as two syllables. And if you have a two-syllable word, it will be written with two characters. So we can then say that learning to read and write Chinese is a process that goes on several levels. And if you want to look at this in more detail, you can check out the cover image for this episode, or a bigger version of that image, which is in the linked to article on Hacking Chinese. Essentially, we have 4 levels, and we're starting at the bottom here and then moving upwards to the top. So the first one is basic characters, and those are characters like mu we talked about before, wood. They are simple characters that started out as pictures and then turned into what we now call pictograms. If someone has shown you images of the origins of Chinese characters and they really look like pictures, these are typically the kind of characters we're talking about. These will be the focus of next week's episode, where we will talk about what they are and how to learn them. The second level is about combining these basic components into compound characters. And we already looked at 2 examples of this. We had xiu, rest, which contained the characters for person and tree put next together inside one single character. We also saw that moon and sun formed bright together. This is the most simple kind of compound where you take the meaning of the 2 characters and kind of combine them into a new meaning that's related to each of them. But there are other compounds that we will look at in part 3. Then, when we have characters and compounds and all that, we still need to combine them into words, and we looked at 中国 and 明年 just now, so China and next year. So now we're not composing new characters or combining components or anything like that. We're taking characters and combining them into words. And there are certain principles for how that's done, even though it is considerably easier to understand words than it is to understand characters. For example, 中国, Middle Kingdom, makes sense. It is not hard to learn. And 明年, meaning next year, even though the characters mean bright and year, it's not that difficult to understand, whereas some characters can be very difficult to understand. Anyway, words will be the focus of part 4. Then, in the 5th part, we will look at how to bring all of this together, wrap everything up, and see how you can use all these things to learn to read and write Chinese. Not just now, but also in the long term. What strategy should you use? We will also talk a little bit about memory and memory techniques. For the rest of this episode, I want to talk about some things that are good to keep in mind when you learn about components, characters, and words. Maybe the most basic question is when you should learn to read and write Chinese. Should you do it at the same time as you learn to speak, or should you maybe delay learning the written language a little bit? The most common way to do it is to learn both in parallel. That's the way most textbooks and most courses are structured. However, I think there are good reasons to delay learning the written language if you can do so and if it's convenient to do so. The problem with learning the spoken and the written language at once is that the cognitive load increases dramatically. And if you think about it, Chinese kids, when they learn how to read and write, they already speak fluently. They don't need to worry about that, they just need to worry about learning characters, and it's still not easy for them. So it's unnecessary for us to do everything at once, and it will mean that everything progresses much more slowly. Another argument in favor of delaying learning the written language is that it doesn't really hurt you to learn characters a little bit later. You will simply just have a little bit more to do in this area, well, when you start learning. But delaying something like pronunciation or the way you learn tones is really bad, because then you can cement bad habits that are hard to fix. That's simply not a problem with delaying characters. If you want to know more about this, please go to episode 1 of the Hacking Chinese podcast, where we spent the entire episode talking about delaying the written language. I also want to say something about reading. So, the way you learn to read and write is by reading. Of course, understanding what you're doing, such as understanding how characters work, which is what we're going to talk about in these episodes, can help you, but it's not a substitute for reading. It's something you should do with a very small fraction of the time you have available. Reading Chinese is the only way to really learn to read Chinese, because, like I said, there are many things that go into reading that simply aren't covered by, say, reading about characters in English or even studying characters themselves. You need to actually read. So what you do in real life is, in a sense, the opposite of what we're going to do in this series. In real life, you start with a sentence and you break it down into words, into characters, and maybe the characters into components if you want to understand them. Now, what we're doing here is the opposite. We're going bottom up. We're starting with the components, we're building up to characters, to words and sentences. And the reason we're doing this is because I want to illustrate how the language works. I don't want to teach you how to decipher a specific sentence. I want to teach you how the language works as a whole. And I simply believe that doing so from the bottom up makes more sense. Still, you should read as much as possible, and if you're a beginner, having a textbook or two works fine. But you can also check out episode 33 of the podcast, where we talked about the best free Chinese reading resources. So assuming that you're going to learn to read and write, and assuming also that the time to do so is now, there are still a few options you can consider. For example, reading only, or typing and reading, or maybe handwriting. And here it's nice to know what your goals are, so you can figure out what works for you and what will enable you to reach your goals. If you're new to Chinese, it might not be immediately apparent, but in Chinese, the difference between being able to read and to write by hand is enormous. We're talking about hundreds or thousands of hours. Whereas in English, we can more or less just read a lot, and most people get decent spelling simply by doing that. That is not the case in Chinese, so it's good to know, do you really need to be able to write by hand? I recommend that most people learn to write by hand, maybe just a few hundred characters, because that allows you to get into characters, know what it's all about, and it also makes sure you know those really common characters very well. Because of course, if you know how to write a character, it is much less likely that you will forget how to read it. However, for practical purposes, handwriting in a modern society is not really something you need to do. It could be part of what you need to do in your particular situation, such as if you're taking a course, or if you think it will be useful in your future life or work. For most people, knowing the basic characters well, plus reading and typing is enough. So while we're on the topic of things that you shouldn't do, let's talk a little bit about a few traps that you can avoid. And some of these are fairly common and even recommended sometimes, but you can safely stay away from them and thus save yourself a lot of time. So number 1, don't waste your time learning the names of all the strokes. Of course, if your teacher says the names of the strokes when he or she writes on the whiteboard, for example, that's fine, you will learn them by osmosis after a while. But you should not spend time learning the names of strokes, and especially not the rarer combinations of strokes. This is largely a waste of time, and it's not something that you will really need. When you get to a more advanced level, you will learn these names anyway, at least the most common ones, but it's definitely not necessary to learn to write characters. Number 2, don't obsess over the theory. And in this series, we are talking about a theory. We're discussing how characters work, how components form characters, and so on. And this is something that is interesting and useful to know, but you shouldn't do it too much. Don't forget about reading. Make sure that you're practicing what you actually want to learn. If your goal is to read, well, you should also read, of course. Number 3, don't clump reviews together when writing. So if you want to learn Chinese characters, many people will tell you that you need to write them hundreds and hundreds of times. And this is true, but don't write them all at once. Don't write the same character 20 or 30 or 50 times in a row. Instead, spread them out as much as possible, preferably using a program that helps you do this, a so-called spaced repetition software. This is many times more efficient than writing the same thing over and over. which could be a good technique if your goal is to write neat and beautiful characters, but I'm going to assume that most people want to be able to just write characters in the first place. If you really care about writing beautifully, you can certainly learn to do that, but that is not my goal in this series. And on the same note, number 4, don't worry if your handwriting is ugly. Most people don't write very well in Chinese when they first start, although some people do. If you have very neat and beautiful handwriting in your native language, the likelihood is that your characters will look okay. Of course, you will still make mistakes such as this stroke shouldn't cross this one because you don't know better, but it might still look neat. Other people struggle a lot and it looks ugly. You can practice as much as you want and it might still look ugly. That is not a problem. Your goal should be to write clear characters that are free from misunderstandings. People shouldn't think that you're writing one character, whereas in fact you're writing something else. And they shouldn't struggle to figure out which component belongs to what character because your spacing is weird. Number 5, don't feel too daunted by the journey ahead. So learning thousands of characters is hard, but it's not like Chinese suddenly becomes useful when you know, say, 3,500 characters. Every character you learn makes it easier to understand written Chinese and enables you to say things or write things that you couldn't write before. So learning 500 characters can be very useful. Learning 1,000 characters, well, even more so. 1,500 characters, even more useful. So every single step you take makes your Chinese more useful. It doesn't stop magically at a certain level, and it doesn't start suddenly at a certain level. It's just a gradual thing where you can get more done and understand more the more you learn. If you want to know more about things you should stay away from, we talked about that in episode 3, How to Not Teach Chinese Characters to Beginners, a 12-step approach. And all the items above are from that article or episode. And this means that we have reached the end of part 1 in this series, and like I said, I will publish part 2 next week, and then probably parts 3, 4, and 5, with some spacing in between for other topics and subjects. And like I also said, if you think it's difficult to follow what I'm talking about here without seeing it, I suggest that you check out the written article on Hacking Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.